Hello, everybody from Geekdom. This is the Microsoft Data Platform Continuity Virtual Group for July 2024. I cannot believe it. It's a summer already. Today with me is going to be a lot of fun. We've got Djordje Jeremic talking about the link feature for Azure SQL Managed Instance. And this thing is really cool. So I will turn that over to him.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David. I'm glad to be here with you. And today I'm going to talk about link feature for Azure SQL Managed Instance. So let me first tell you a couple of words about myself. So before joining Microsoft Azure SQL Product Group around 4 years ago, I actually had a career in software development, mostly for automotive and telecommunication industries. So that was mostly embedded software development. Then I joined Microsoft, first as an engineer, actually, and then I transitioned to product manager role. And I'm currently focused on areas of high availability, disaster recovery, and data mobility. And one of the features I'm responsible for is link feature for managed instance. This is the agenda for today. It will be a mixture of higher level and like a deeper like dive kind of content. We'll also have some demos at the end. Hopefully we will fit into like 60 minutes, and in like if you're interested, like we can talk more about this during Q&A session. And I will, as well, like my proposal is to hold the questions until Q&A, just to secure that we have like enough time and we do not miss this 60-minute mark. Okay, then I guess we should dive in. And first, before starting about like link feature, in my experience, Azure SQL service offerings are a bit a point of confusion for some customers to be mostly. So in my opinion, it's a good idea to provide a very brief reminder. Where are we in this map? So Azure SQL has like 3 service offerings in Azure Cloud. That's SQL Server on Azure VMs, and that's infrastructure as a service. And it has 2 platform as a service offerings. That's Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database. So Azure SQL Managed Instance is, as it says here, and I believe it's really good summary, fully managed SQL Server engine as a service. So maintaining a very high level of compatibility with a SQL Server on-prem. In contrast to that, Azure SQL Database is related service, which is scoped to a single database. And uh, like again, SQL MI is a big topic. I think that probably the most important thing that you should know about it is that we have 2 service tiers. One is general purpose, and it contains a remote storage layer, and it's good for most business workloads, and it has limitation of 16 terabytes and 100 databases. And we also have a business critical, which has a locally attached storage, and it's really meant for business highly demanding applications. Something actually that we introduced recently, and that's a public preview of the next generation of general purpose service tier. And it actually pushes the limits to 32 terabytes and 500 databases. So I'll just leave this topic as it is. And like, if you have any questions pertaining to this, we can address this later during Q&A session. Okay, so link feature for Azure SQL MI. So what is link feature for Azure SQL MI? So we created this capability in both SQL Server and SQL Managed Instance to enable the two to connect and then make certain data mobility scenarios happen between the two. So if you're on-prem, let's say SQL Server user, you can use this feature to leverage Azure. So you can continue running your workload on-prem, but Azure can provide a scenario such as read scale out, disaster recovery. In general, we say that actually you can do app modernization, and that means that you can benefit from this rich ecosystem of other Azure offerings while keeping your primary workload on on-prem. If you wish to migrate your apps and databases which they support, that is made available using this feature. And for instance, if you're SQL MI user already and you're running like your workloads in the cloud, you still might actually need there are some user scenarios in which you would like to create a copy of your data on SQL Server, or most importantly, there is regulatory reasons for some institutions, let's say financial institutions, that require you that, say, as a bank, you demonstrate that you are not locked in by a certain vendor in this case being Azure. So you need to be able to demonstrate that for whatever reason, you can maintain your business continuity by leaving your current vendor. And this is one of those features that can enable you this regulatory requirement. So more about this a bit later. So let's see now what are capabilities, basic capabilities of the link feature and what are supported scenarios. So in this first part of this presentation, we link is something that is quite adequately represented by an arrow. So apparently it has endpoints, it has direction, and it's used to replicate databases. And let's keep it on that level of detail for now. And in the next chapter, we will double click on this arrow and see what is it all about. So the capability that is currently generally available, and it's available for SQL Server versions 2016 and on, is the capability to configure a link. And this can enable you to create read-only replicas in Azure, to do read scale out, and to do a migration of your databases into Azure if you wish. In public preview, we also have a capability to create a link from SQL Managed Instance to SQL Server. This capability is supported in SQL Server 2022 only, and it brings you additional capabilities to do this, as we call it, reverse migration and regulatory drills that I mentioned previously. But also some customers wish to occasionally have a business need to create, let's say, a replica of their like production database to some test dev environment where they're running SQL Server. And this is also made possible by capability to create a link from managed instance to SQL Server. Finally, we have a capability to do a link failover. This is also supported in SQL Server 2022 only, and the main user scenario that requires this capability is disaster recovery. And using this capability, you can do both handle actual outage scenarios and disaster recovery drills. So let's see a bit actually kind of how these scenarios look like, how those flows look like. So let's first see actually how to make a data mobility to Azure. So you are running your SQL Server somewhere on-prem or elsewhere in a different cloud or on VM, and you have your app pointing actually to your SQL Server running some read and write workload. And to take the advantage of Azure, you create this link to initiate a replication of one or more of your databases to Azure SQL MI. And at that point, your data becomes available to other services in Azure. And also, you can then delegate your read-only workload, if you have such, to Azure SQL MI. So only your read-write workload is performed on-prem. And if you wish to do so, if you wish to migrate your databases, I need to emphasize that this is really optional for customers who are looking to the ways to migrate to Azure. You can simply cut the cord and then repoint your applications, and then your primary workload is executed in Azure. We can also say something about a scenario about like creating a link from SQL MI to SQL Server. So in this situation, you're already running your primary workload in Azure on SQL MI. Perhaps you're also leveraging other services provided by Azure. And let's say that you're a financial institution and you need to do a drill to basically every once in a while to demonstrate that if need be, you are able to perform actually offload off Azure off cloud migration. So what do? You create a link to replicate your databases to SQL Server and then basically cut over, and then your databases are like available as standalone databases in SQL Server 2022. We'll see a brief demonstration of that later on in this presentation. And finally, let's see a flow of disaster recovery. So here again, we have, let's say, a link to replicate data from SQL Server 2022 to SQL MI. So the first step is always to create this link, so your application is constantly ongoing. And let's say that you want to perform a disaster recovery drill. So imagine that your SQL Server 2022 became unavailable for some reason, and you really need to continue your business using SQL MI only. Then you initiate a link failover, and then you can your on-prem application or some other application that generates read-write workload can be repointed to Azure SQL MI, and your data replication flow is now reversed. And this is a drill situation, so SQL Server 2022 is not really down. So this data replication from SQL MI to SQL Server actually works. Now, when you want to bring your disaster recovery drill to conclusion, you can do failover again or fail back, and then basically restore the original state actually of your application. Now, application is your application is communicating with SQL Server for read and write workload. So that was a higher level overview. So as I promised, now we can double click on that arrow and see basically what that arrow is about and how you actually kind of make this link happen. So first, most important requirement for establishing a link is establishing a network connectivity between SQL Server and SQL Managed Instance. And I have to admit that for many customers, even today, after this feature being around for a while now, this could be a pain point. And this is not really due to maybe lack of understanding what needs to be done, but let's say that in some organizations, making requirements happen can be hard. So you have to ensure that TCP connectivity can be established between your database mirroring endpoint on SQL Server and a range of ports in the subnet which hosts Azure SQL Managed Instance. So in this example, we have port 5022 on SQL Server side, and on SQL MI, you need access to a range of ports, so both 5022 and the entire 11K range. And why this might be difficult, so if everything here is under your own control, your administrator of your network, then you can open these ports. You can hopefully configure your firewalls or NSGs easily, but in a bigger organization, you probably have to talk to somebody, and there are some security policies in place. So this can be actually a bit more kind of complicated and a longer story. If you're outside of Azure, then you also need to make your SQL Server communicate with virtual network in Azure. And typically solutions that you would need to employ to do this is a site to site or point to site. If you want to do quick proof of concepts, and you want to skip the most of the trouble that this setting up the connectivity kind of brings, that what we typically do both internally and what we advise to our customers is to provision actually Azure SQL on a VM somewhere in Azure, because in that way, establishing connectivity between subnets which host the SQL Server and a subnet which hosts the SQL MI is significantly simpler. Also, one should just to remind again that there are different types of firewalls. So we had customers which had to troubleshoot their local network connectivity heavily to realize there is yet another type of firewall somewhere preventing the traffic to pass, which is required for this communication for link feature. We will, in the tooling that we provide for this feature in SSMS, we provide a utility that can help you validate whether connectivity between SQL Server and SQL MI you have chosen to establish link between has these requirements satisfied. So, link is based on distributed availability groups. In fact, when you're configuring link between SQL Server and SQL MI, you're essentially configuring a database availability group. On SQL Server, link feature is in no way different from database distributed availability groups. So this distributed availability group, as you can see here, it spans actually two different domains and two platforms. So you might be, let's say your SQL Server is somewhere on-prem, SQL MI is obviously in Azure. And in order to configure this distributed availability group, you need to obviously, you need to satisfy the connectivity requirement. This is something we talked about previously, but you also need to enable trust between your SQL Server instance and SQL Managed Instance. And for link feature, this is done by exchanging public key certificates. Also good to know that Windows Server Failover cluster is not needed for this feature. I believe in 2016 you have to have it configured, even though it's not leveraged by the link feature. But for more recent versions of SQL Server, this is not necessary. And also just to say that, as you already know, distributed availability group connect to availability groups. Your availability group on-prem, can have one or more replicas, one primary and multiple secondaries. And on SQL MI side, availability groups are actually fully managed, because managed instance is a fully managed server. So for every database that is created there, we automatically create availability group for you, and this link feature essentially connects this availability group with the availability group you explicitly created on-prem. Also, a brief reminder for GP service tier, there is a single replica of your database, and for business critical, there is 4 replicas. 1 is read-write and 3 are read-only. So say that you actually have like multiple databases that you wish to replicate. So say that like on the lower part of the screen, you see a SQL Server hosting multiple databases, and on the top part of the screen, you see SQL MI. So what actually, if you want to replicate multiple databases to SQL MI, you will create availability group. You will create a distributed availability group on top of it if AG is not already present, and then you will create a link on top of that. And the same for DB2 and same for DB3. It's important to know that not all databases on SQL Server and SQL MI need to participate in a link. So here, for instance, you can see that there are some databases on SQL Server and SQL MI that are not part of the link. And those databases, of course, are read-write. When you replicate a database using a link, then a replica of your database actually on SQL MI, if you have created a SQL Server to SQL MI link, is read-only. This is something important to know. And of course, you can then delegate your actually read-only workloads to your read-only replicas. So let's go a bit deeper here and see how actually one configures the link. And here I will use the snippets because this is as low as you will go when you configure a link if you're not leveraging provided tooling. So there are multiple steps there, but essentially the very last step and probably the most important step here, which actually demonstrates that creating a link is no different than configuring a database availability group, is basically creating a database availability group between an availability group on SQL Server and availability group on SQL MI. In fact, the only thing here that tells you that this DAG is not kind of legacy like DAG is this listener URL for MI side of this distributed availability group. You see here that you have some FQDN and you have a port number, and then you have some server equal to something. So this is a kind of a signature of a managed instance link feature, and this is basically kind of the only main difference in the, let's say, a snippet that would create a classical or legacy distributed availability group between two SQL servers and link between SQL Server and SQL MI. And this is something that you have to do on SQL Server. But configuring a link is a multi-step process, so you need to do something on SQL MI as well. So once you have created this distributed availability group on SQL Server, on SQL MI, you would have to initiate a command which would essentially join actually to the database availability group on SQL Server. This is typically done using like PowerShell commandlet, or you can actually do it directly in REST, or you can actually use one of the provided tooling solutions. So essentially, in summary, two steps. One, create a DAG on SQL Server, then join managed instance to this DAG you have created on SQL Server. Now, what about failover? Failover is something that I've mentioned before. And here, when I say a failover, I mean a failover in a fashion that may be familiar to you from distributed availability groups or availability groups. So links support two flavors of failover. One is planned failover, and the way to invoke it is actually to run this command, as simple as this, from a primary instance. So it needs to be initiated on the primary instance, whichever it is. So if you have a SQL Server to SQL MI link, then you have to execute this on SQL Server. If you have a link from SQL MI to SQL Server, then you can execute this on SQL MI. We also support forced failover, and this should be also familiar from availability groups and distributed availability groups. So this is supported if you wish to do this by using T-SQL, but hopefully you will have a script or use actually provided tooling solution that I will mention later on. Now, observability. So how do you know that your link is working? So we're replicating a database there. And when you're replicating a database, you first go through some initial seeding process where you basically replicate the data that is currently available in database. And from that point on, you keep replicating individual log records in a synchronous manner to your remote instance, which is SQL MI or SQL Server. So for the time being, you can rely on DMVs and T-SQL, which should be familiar to you from DAGs and AGs. So you basically can query them to see how the replication is going and what is the current replication status. Also, option number 2 is to leverage Azure API. So in contrast to the first one, where you can run these querying these DMVs on either SQL Server or SQL MI, Azure API pertains to the SQL MI side only, but the benefit is that you can get some additional information about a replication that is not available by querying the DMVs. Also, you can use a PowerShell if you wish. And finally, you can leverage SQL Server Management Studio dashboard. So as you probably know, dashboard is not something meant for distributed availability groups. We updated it to support MI link, but the support is provided only for the links from SQL Server to SQL MI. And yeah, so now we're actually coming to demos. So this will be a short demo train, like that should hopefully fit into 15 minutes. The first demo will be the longest purposefully, and then 3 shorter demos. And this is basically the intent with this demo is to demonstrate this actually tooling solution we provide and how you can manipulate the link using SQL Server Management Studio. Also forward, all these demonstrations are done with SQL Server 2022, but as I mentioned previously, most of the capabilities are available for SQL Server 2016 and on, except failover and creating a link from SQL MI to SQL Server. Okay, so let's start with the first demo, and the first demo shows a read scale out in Azure with MI link. And here we will we'll start from SQL Server here, which is on virtual machine, and it's SQL Server 2022 Enterprise Edition. And here we have one test database that we wish to replicate. So in this example, that's encrypted database with an asymmetric key, and this is made possible actually by configuring EKM module to communicate with Azure Key Vault, which keeps this asymmetric key. We wish to replicate this database to the MI, and this managed instance is in business critical tier. And how we do our replication, we invoke a wizard that is meant for replication. And after brief introduction, you provide some information. So most importantly, this is the name of the link, which will be the name of your distributed availability group. And you have some options here for extended troubleshooting and some additional kind of capabilities. And then you click on next, and it will provide a list of databases. So currently we have only one database here, and it will warn you that this is an encrypted database. Why? Because it is your responsibility to ensure that the recipient of this database, in this case SQL MI, is provided the very access to the very same asymmetric key located in the key vault. So when you create a link, your primary replica is here on the SQL Server. You can do some configuration of the endpoint, database mirroring endpoint. And also there is some information here, actually, what needs to be enabled for this. So regarding the backup on SQL Server database needs to be in full recovery mode. And so you need to take log backups. And finally, there is something about link endpoint, which we'll touch upon later on. We have to log into the SQL MI that we wish to replicate to. All of the authentication methods are supported, and it will show up here. We cannot do any configuration regarding endpoint because this is fully service managed, and there is a small tool here to aid connectivity checks. That's something I mentioned previously. Now the wizard will do some validation checks to make sure that you can actually create this link. And finally, if everything is okay, you will be provided with a list of steps that will be executed. Actually. So you can also, there is a utility tool to generate a script of everything that SSMS will run in the background, which is convenient for you to create your own scripts if you prefer to use scripting approach. And then you click on next, and the wizard will start executing the steps. So most importantly, it will establish the trust by exporting the certificate from MI to SQL Server. It will export the SQL Server endpoint certificate to SQL MI. It will do some health checks on availability group. And finally, as the very last step, it will join managed instance to distributed availability group that you have created on SQL Server. This is sped up, but usually finishes in less than a minute. The very last step is typically the longest. And everything looks okay. We can close this wizard and look what happened now. So in the Object Explorer, something new shows up under Always On High Availability. There is availability group that the wizard created and distributed availability group. And basically you can already see that a replica of this database has been created on SQL MI and also distributed availability group under Always On High Availability menu. So like we can do a simple test here to demonstrate that this data replication works. So we have some simple table in the test database, and you can see that this table has been replicated to this managed instance. And let's say that now we want to add additional replica of this database to completely different SQL MI. So we'll choose a different SQL MI, which is in general purpose tier. And we can repeat the very same process. So we can initiate a creation of a new link in a very similar way. We will go much quicker through the wizard now, provide a name and keep other options checked. And this is, so again, the purpose of this demonstration is to show that if you have a business need to create multiple replicas of a database that is hosted on SQL Server, you can do it and the replication will happen like to all connected managed instances. So here we added the new managed instance. All validation checks should pass. And once again, we will execute the wizard to replicate the database to SQL MI. Everything looks good. And now you see that additional distributed availability group has been added to the Always On High Availability menu. And that on this new managed instance, GP01 as well, we have a replica of this database. Now, we can actually do a real test that replication is working to both managed instances. So let's first ensure that the existing table is there. It is really there. And now let's create a new table in the database on SQL Server. This will be table number 2. And it has been added to the database. And now let's validate that the same table has been replicated to both managed instances, to both read-only replicas on those 2 managed instances. And yeah, indeed, we can see that this table has been added to both read-only replicas. And you can also inspect that in the Azure portal as well. They're both online. And this completes the first demo. So the next demo will show us how to perform disaster recovery drill with MI Link. So both the failover and failback to SQL Server. So here we start with the link. Let me just actually play. So we'll start with already established link between SQL Server and SQL MI. So we see that this database has already been replicated and that we see that actually 2 availability groups have been created. The primary is on SQL Server and the secondary is on the MI. You can validate this in this manner. Endpoint URL is MIFQDN. And to do a failover, basically, this is what you do in drill. You should invoke a failover wizard, and it can be done actually from the right-click menu on 4 different spots. You can either right-click on the database, or you can click on actually database DAG that you created for the link, and it opens a new wizard. Here you get some information about the current replica state, its role, and what types of failover are supported there. And then you choose a failover type. So planned failover is meant for data lossless operations like migration or disaster recovery drill, while forced failover is primarily meant for actual outages. So here you need to log into the remote replica. In this case, this is SQL MI. Here, actually, there is an option about link removal. So when you want to do a failover, you want to keep this option like unchecked. And then you can also generate a script if you wish. And finally, you execute the steps. This goes rather fast. And after it has been executed, you can already see the change. So now the AG on MI is in primary role, and the one on the SQL Server is in the secondary role. And we can actually, to demonstrate that this basically failover really happened, we can add new table to the database
I'm gonna
on the
leave for a
SQL
bit.
Server. And you can see that this data has been replicated back to SQL Server. And what you now want to do is to do a failback. So you will run a wizard again. And we will do it in the very same manner. So we'll choose plan manual failover. We will log into the remote instance, leave this option unchecked, and initiate another failover to bring our primary replica back to SQL Server. And you can see that availability group on SQL Server is now in primary role, the one on the MI is in secondary role, and that the original replication flow has been restored. We can validate that by adding a new table, say table number 4, and you can see that this table has been added to both primary replica and to secondary replica. So this was basically to show that during this failover, the link remains. However, the data replication flow is reversed, and that replica on managed instance becomes new primary, and it's able to run, read, and work operations. That's the end of the second demo. Now let's very briefly show actually the demo of migration of a database. So again, here we start with the existing link between SQL Server and SQL MI. And just to show that primary is on the SQL Server, the secondary is on SQL MI. And to do a database migration, we run the very same wizard. And we choose plan manual failover because we want this to be data lossless operation. Log into the remote instance. But here we check the option for link removal, and this will give actually additional warnings to ensure smooth cutover to Azure. It is recommended that you stop your workload. And also there is optional cleanup on SQL Server if you do not wish to use this availability group on SQL Server for other purposes, then you can clean it up and remove it. And you can see here that this database is actually kind of standalone. There is no availability group on it. And if we add a new table to either SQL Server or SQL MI, we can see that they have not been replicated to the other party, which is simply a sanity check to show that link has been removed. It's important to understand that if you're doing a migration scenario is supported for all SQL Server versions from starting from 2016. And however, this is the only type actually of failover operations supported for 2022, we support both removal of the link after changing the replication flow and not. But for 2016 and up to 2019, migration is the only operation. So after making SQL MI primary instance of the link will necessarily be removed. So trying to say that, like, if you run this wizard with, let's say, 2016 or 2019, you will see that that checkbox about removing the link is disabled, meaning that you have to remove the link. The link has to be removed after this operation is done. And finally, the very, very brief demo, and this one is basically about this kind of off-cloud mobility and about replicating the data from SQL MI to SQL Server. So here we have an example database on SQL MI, which we wish to replicate to SQL Server. And we will start a new link wizard to initiate this replication. Again, just want to point out that this capability is available for SQL Server 2022 only. You configure the endpoint on SQL Server if you wish, or you can leave the defaults. And you basically run validation checks, which will ensure that the link is created. There is no real difference in the steps executed when you're creating a link from SQL Server to SQL MI and from SQL MI to SQL Server. I'll just make a manual jump. And here you can see that the availability groups have been created. So you have a distributed availability groups with two replicas. The primary replica is now on MI. The secondary replica is on SQL Server. You can see it there as well. And you can see that this database has been replicated to SQL Server. And yes, so this concludes this demo. Yeah, so the final topic before we kind of actually go into QA session is the future improvements. So link feature has been around for some time now. So as I mentioned before, some capabilities are already generally available, like a capability to create a link and to do migration to Azure, to do read scale out in Azure. Some capabilities are in public preview. That's a capability to do failover and to do reverse replication from SQL MI to SQL Server. And this journey is continuing. There are additional capabilities and improvements we wish to bring to this feature. So let's look at maybe kind of the top things that we are currently working on. So let's see what's ahead. Support for multiple databases per link. So you remember that I mentioned that we create a dedicated distributed availability group for every database. And there is actually technological limitation that we have to remove in order to make it possible to replicate multiple databases using a single link. Now, you obviously need to create a number of links when you want to create to replicate a number of databases. But this is not only just some convenience, this is really what our customers need in order, let's say, to work with full-fledged availability groups. Typically, we hear customers say, okay, I have an availability group with typically a number of databases, but I really want to do a replication to Azure as well, to have one replica of my availability group in Azure, and I want to use a link feature. And this improvement, which we are kind of working hard on, will make this possible. Improve transparent connection routing. So you probably saw during demonstration of actually link configuring wizard in SSMS, there is a tab about transparent connection routing. So what is this about? Typically, and one part of every disaster recovery drill scenario or database migration scenario is that once the failover is complete or migration is complete, you want your application to start communicating with a new primary replica. And currently, some manual work is needed to make this happen for Managed Instance Link. For instance, if you're familiar with Managed Instance and let's say kind of a feature that is called failover groups, you know that for that feature, we provide something that's called listeners. So basically, the service provided endpoints that always kind of talk to the primary or the secondary. So your application, you don't need to do any form of configuration, any form of repointing. You just make sure that your application talks to this listener. We are also working to bring that functionality to the link feature. Finally, not really finally, but maybe one of actually the third improvement I selected for this opportunity is the interoperability with this, with other features such as failover groups. Why is this important? Our customers who already have like failover groups as a disaster recovery protection in Azure, and they are migrating their new databases to SQL MI. They like want to have a disaster recovery protection is in Azure as soon as they migrate the database. Since those two features are not currently interoperable, that means that this is currently not possible, and this is one obstacle for our customers that we wish to remove. Yeah, and this concludes my talk for today. So now I'll be happy to take your questions.
Right. Thank you very much. That is cool stuff. If anybody has any questions, we don't have any in the chat window right now. So if you have any questions, either drop them in the chat window or honestly just come off of mute and turn on your camera and say hi. And if we don't, you covered everything really thoroughly. So during the presentation, you actually answered a couple of the questions that I had. So that was great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything so far. We'll give everybody another moment or two. And if we
Sure.
don't have any, uh, where is your contact info?
So
Right
yeah,
there.
that's on the next slide. Yeah.
Perfect.
So you can reach out to our contact to our product group using this link.
Perfect. Yeah. If you're watching this after the fact on the YouTube channel, please do not hesitate to reach out to any of us. If you have any questions for him, go ahead and contact him right there. If you have any questions for us with the HADR virtual group, or honestly, if you have a presentation that you would like to see, or if you'd like to present for our group, let us know. I would be happy to hear from you. And even if it's one of those questions where it's a really good question and we don't already have a presentation lined up or ready to go for it, call us weird. We'll actually create presentations for you just to answer your questions. It's a lot of fun, and it's honestly where a lot of our content comes from. Cool. I don't see any additional questions come in, so I would say thank you very, very much. We appreciate you staying up late for this. Always fun, and we look forward to the next one.
And thank you for the opportunity, David and Chris.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'll stop the recording now.